And now we turn to romantic relationships. So, in general, we are going to talk about love or minimally relationships. Then we're going to get to attractiveness and what makes people attractive. And then finally, what keeps relationships strong. So, first of all, I want you to think about these questions before we get to anything. Just think to yourself how people find partners, how it's different in college versus the real world, and then why do we find romantic partners? And so, just for now, take a minute, pause the recording, and give it a shot. Just jot down a couple notes. Well, we're first going to start with why people find partners. And this gets back to some basic foundations of really humanity. And we're going to talk about some evolutionary theory aspects as well. So, first, that belonging is a fundamental need, a fundamental and evolutionary need. And we say this because groups provide mates, which, from an evolutionary perspective, if you are completely solo, you do not want to be around anyone, literally do not want to be around anyone, you cannot have offspring, and therefore that gene will not be passed down. But really, even if you don't want to say that it's evolutionary, you don't like that terminology, you can't really debate that people who are alone are at a disadvantage in many, many ways. Groups also can help provide food, especially in times when people are sick. They can care for offspring, and some survival tasks like hunting large animals, maintaining defense from other groups, are best accomplished in groups when you are in groups. And especially when there is competition for some kind of limited resource, that is actually a really, really powerful stimulus for forming relationships. And because of this, we have an internal mechanism or set of mechanisms that guide us to belonging in groups, and in groups where we have lasting relationships. That's also a key. So two big things here. The first is that people need frequent personal contacts and interactions. They need them. Ideally, these things are pleasant, but actually the more important side is that there is a lack of negativity. Sometimes, some of you who might have been homesick when you came to college or in other times of your life know that sometimes just being around other people, even if it's just watching TV, not really interacting, sometimes that can be good. And then the second part is that we perceive that there is, or need to perceive that there is a stable, continuable interpersonal bond with people. You have to feel not only is it that you enjoy your time with them, or it's at least not negative, but that it can be continued into the future. And so, what that means is that if you are, at the end of a night when you go to a party or some kind of group activity, if you really hit it off as friends with someone, you might exchange numbers, say, look me up on Facebook or something like that, so that you can be around them later on in time. And this continues the relationship over time. And finally, you can see that when we have these needs to be around people, there's also a sense of distress when people are not having this occur. If you are isolated, if you don't have the ability to be around other people, you can have distress. So before we get into kind of the good things, let's talk about some of the bad things. If we do not if we fail to secure this need, then what can happen? Well, partially, why does it occur in the first place? Because people are shy. Actually, just under 50% of Americans, all Americans, say that they are shy. And obviously, some people are more than others. But this shyness can be difficult to deal with because people who are shy oftentimes reject other people, mainly, though, because they are afraid of being rejected themselves. So you might not want to hang out with a group of people or a person because you are afraid of yourself being rejected. We also know that shyness has genetic components. It also can be learned, though, and there is continuity in time in shyness from longitudinal studies. And beyond just simply rejecting other people in social situations, shy people also tend to evaluate themselves negatively in these social encounters. They expect to fail and blame themselves when there is failure. And you put all of this together, people can go into isolation, which causes loneliness. So, loneliness, it can be thought of as the discrepancy between the level of social contact a person has and what they want. So, discrepancy between the level of social contact someone has and what they want. So, someone who has, 5 friends they hang out with regularly could be just fine, but some other people who had 5 people they regularly hang out with could feel lonely if they want more than that or increased depth of relationship with people. People are most likely to be lonely in the first year of college, after breakups, after moving, and after the death of a loved one, so after death of a spouse in particular. And people who are divorced, widowed, or separated are actually more lonely than the people who are the same age as they are, but who were never in relationships. And why might that be? Well, if you think about it, the people who have had a closeness, intimate relationship with someone, they go from having that to not having it. They know kind of what they are missing, and oftentimes they want to have that type of relationship and no longer do. Whereas people who either choose to be not or to not be married, or who just for whatever the reason don't end up married or with someone long term, they don't have that situation. They kind of learn to deal with not having that, potentially having that single individual person who they are super close with. And how do they cope with this? Well, some people just kind of accept it. Some people try to be friendlier to other people, read and watch TV, things like that. There's a whole lot of different areas. Okay, so let's talk about finding people in college. Think for a minute about how people find romantic relationships in college. Just think to yourself for a second, jot down a couple ideas. And many of you, if we were in class, what always happens is people say, through friends, through organizations. And it usually takes some prodding, but eventually there's one person who's kind of bashful and ends up giving the response I'm looking for, which is hooking up. For most people, the age of first marriage is now well after college, meaning that there's more time for dating and hooking up. And people now look to college as a time to have fun and not really committed relationships. Some people will, but some people don't as well. And minimally, you are not thought to be a failure if you do not get married straight out of undergrad. In fact, many people would look at those people and kind of question that these days. There's a big shift from 50 years ago. So before we talk about this, and some of you might already be kind of uncomfortable talking about hooking up, that is in part because of the definition. So we need to talk about what hooking up is. So I want you to think about what it is to you. Just take a second, jot down a couple ideas, pause the recording. So what is it? We have lots of different definitions. Some people, some of you probably put down or wrote down, thought of something like having sex with someone who you are not close to, or having sex with someone who you normally wouldn't. Some people would say it doesn't require someone to have sex. You could just end up being in intimate actions. Well, let me give you a couple of different kinds of definitions. So the first one is intimate interactions outside of dating or exclusive relationships. Intimate interactions outside of dating or exclusive relationships. That's fairly straightforward, but it's also kind of broad. Also, another one, and this is a genuine, a genuine definition from an article. When a girl and a guy get together for a physical encounter and don't necessarily expect anything further. And it can include anything from kissing to sex or anything in between. And a couple things, or well, one thing real quick before we move on. I did say when a girl and a guy get together for a physical encounter, because we'll talk about why this is a relatively new thing we're looking at here, hooking up. But it also has been seen, tends to be more common, at least empirically, what we know so far in in opposite sex relationships. Additionally, this term is purposely ambiguous, and this is one of the keys. I would write this down. And it is purposely ambiguous so that nobody but you, and possibly the other person, knows what happened. And this leaves room for what we like to refer to as plausible deniability. And this allows you to disclose behavior with less risk of disapproval by other people. Meaning that if you are in one area where a friend comes up to you who is not very encouraging of promiscuous sexual behavior, you might say, "Oh yeah, I hooked up with them, but we just made out." Whereas another person who might be more promiscuous, you might say, "Oh yeah, well we went further than that." There's an ability to disclose what you want to disclose because the term is vague. It occurs fairly often, but not as often as people think. People tend to overestimate how often it occurs. So in one study, over 90% of women said that they believe that hooking up happened very often or fairly often, and only, quote unquote, 40% said they did it themselves. Another sample, though, said 78% of people said that they hooked up. Another said the range of times that they had hooked up, another study found a range of 0 to 65 hookups with an average of 10.8 and a median of 6. Essentially, there is a lot of heterogeneity here, in part because you could get varying responses based on what people think hooking up is. So instead, if you don't want to be quite as forward, and instead of saying, "Have you had sex with someone in an uncommitted relationship?" if you just say, "Have you hooked up with someone?" you could get different responses to those two questions. Regardless of the actual occurrences of it, we do know, or we're pretty sure people overestimate how much it occurs. And part of that is because of contemporary student culture. And it normalizes, and possibly, depending on what you believe, encourages sex outside of romantic relationships. So, there seems to be, at least in my opinion, think about all of the movies that you've seen about college. I can't think of any movies that are about college that do not revolve in some way around sexuality or hooking up. So you see Old School on the left, Superbad in the middle, Animal House on the right. I now that I say it, actually, one time in class, I think it was last semester, I asked if anybody could think of a college or university-based movie that didn't involve hooking up, and somebody rightfully pointed out Monsters University. But that's about the only one that I can really think of that is that way, and that is questionable to be included in this discussion. So think about how you think that contemporary culture and student culture might either allow for or even encourage sexuality. And this is something to think about, not just for you, but for children in the future, for policies, for how schools should handle this. Should there be more interventions to attempt on college campuses to try to get this to be tamped down a little bit? And how much of a problem is it, especially when we add in the influence of alcohol, which can cause a variety of problems we'll talk about in a little while. So, moving on to some more aspects of hooking up. How do dating and hooking up relate? Well, some academics have posited that in recent years, hooking up has actually replaced dating as the dominant way for heterosexual couples to get together on college campuses. So, how do they get together? We talked about, or I asked you to think about this a little bit earlier. Well, if you think about dating, what does dating mean? Some people now think that dating means that you're already a couple. Back in the day, it wouldn't be quite as odd for someone to go on dates with multiple people at the same time. One Friday, go out to dinner with one person, the next week, go to dinner with another person. Today, that seems to be less approved of, and you can tell me if I'm wrong there, but that seems to be, in general, what people's opinions are. And because of this, people are not really doing the dating thing as much unless they already know each other fairly well. And so the dating, traditional dating, where you ask someone if they would like to go to dinner when you don't know them particularly well, is less likely to occur. And this is another key aspect I definitely think you should write down is talking about how dating and hooking up each have their own scripts. Sexual scripts theory, and scripts being SCRIPTS. Sexual scripts theory says that sexual episodes are, quote, influenced by standard expectancies and practices that identify the content, sequence, and boundaries for sexual acts. I'll say that again, or you can rewind it, doesn't matter. Sexual episodes are influenced by standard expectancies and practices that identify the content, sequence, and boundaries for the sexual act. So it's basically an understanding that people have about, within a given culture, about what is going to go on in different romantic contexts. So the traditional dating script was that men would initiate invitations, would contact women in advance of the event, men would plan the activities, arrange for travel, and pay for everything. You can think of this kind of as a 1950s style of dating. So a man comes up to a woman, says, I would like to invite you to go to dinner next Thursday. And then they would plan out what the couple would do, how to get from where to where, and pay for everything. Hooking up, on the other hand, is generally thought to be where it occurs at the culmination of a night among a larger group of people at a party or a bar. So there's a party, or you're at a bar or something, and at the end of the night, people pair off. And instead of explicit communication in the traditional dating script, in hooking up situations, the cues are nonverbal, meaning through eye contact, body language, attentiveness. You can kind of tell if something is going to happen without even having to ask. In terms of the expenses, the main expense in a hooking up situation is alcohol, and that tends to be bought for yourself unless rounds are bought. There could be some cultural differences between where I'm from in Virginia, or at least went to graduate school in Virginia, and down in the South, but generally speaking, it would be kind of forward to buy a drink for someone. It would even be kind of creepy. Another thing, though, about alcohol is that it's central to hooking up situations. It is most often consumed by both people because it's a social lubricant. It allows you to lower inhibitions, allows you to deal with potential rejection, and also makes it just easier in general to allow yourself to participate in activities, sexual activities you might not later, which, of course, does have problems associated with it. We are, as I have on the screen, problems with question mark. We're going to get to that in one second. There's a lot of problems throughout here, so don't worry. I'm not trying to endorse all of these behaviors. But emotion is also different in traditional dating versus hooking up. In traditional dating, sexual intimacy required emotional intimacy, meaning that in a traditional sense, you would only, at least theoretically, you would only be sexual with people if there was an emotional component to it. That is not so in a hookup script. In hookup situations, you don't even barely need to know the people, so there is no requirement there. Okay, so let's get to some of the problems here. So the first one, sexual hookup scripts where there's spontaneous sex with typically impaired judgment and a little explicit communication lends for tons of problems. Risks for STIs, risks for sexual coercion, rape, miscommunication about sexuality in general. And the sexual coercion, the kind of second big problem here, women are actually at higher risk for sexual assault inside college than outside college. Meaning that if you are an 18-year-old who is not attending college, you might think that because, if you're an 18-year-old who can't get into college, maybe you'd be put into a worse situation or something because of socioeconomic status or something like that. That woman would actually be less likely to have be sexual assaulted than people in college. And you would think that college would be a place where it wouldn't occur as much. There are a variety of statistics out there about how much sexual coercion occurs, how much sexual assault, how much rape occurs, because of some different definitions. In some articles, it says that sexual assault occurs if people do not give explicit okay acceptance for any sexual act, which means that literally in some cases people say if you do not say something along the lines of yes I'll have sex or yes or some kind of affirmative consent, even if you wanted to do something, then that can be considered sexual assault because the other person did not get affirmation from you. And that's a whole nother discussion we don't need to get into here, but I'm just trying to explain why you will see so many different statistics about how many people experience sexual assault. I'm also not trying to say any of those are or are not sexual assault, just explaining the methodological concern. And even if people are not sexually coerced, which could be trying to get someone to do something they might be uncomfortable with, then outright abuse, rape, etc., problematic as well, obviously. And typically, very little good comes from this. The typical outcomes reported in the literature are shame, regret, rumination, other forms of emotional distress, especially among women. This is not to say that, two people couldn't just, find their soulmates in this way, and somehow it just means that is less likely to occur than we might hope or something. So how much homogeneity is there? Basically, how often does this occur across groups, across times and situations? Well, as I say on the screen, many groups don't have it happen. Fraternities are different than Bible studies. Peer influences can contribute to risky behavior, and particular drinking. Students drinking more actually tend to have more problematic sexual experiences, which is not surprising at all. And we also already said that alcohol is key to the hookup script. But let's get to three more ways that, three characteristics of communication in college student networks that can influence how much this occurs across places. So the first one is frequency of communication, and this is frequency of communication about sexual behavior. The more groups talk about sexuality, the more it can sanction behavior. And I don't mean if they talk about it in negative ways. I mean if you're talking about it in positive ways or even just neutral ways. If you say that someone has had this happen the last weekend and there is no negativity that comes from it, well, it's kind of implicitly sanctioning it in some senses. And this communication can also promote misperceptions about the norms of the prevalence of things occurring. Meaning that if you hear every weekend, you hear, oh, somebody else hooked up with someone, but you know 100 people, then it could be that, one person every other week is hooking up with someone out of 100 people. It's just because everybody's talking about it that you start to perceive that it is occurring more frequently. I mean, this is the same thing about terrorist attacks and violent behaviors coming from people abroad. You have one terrorist attack, you say the United States is under threat, when in fact, you'd have to have how many 10 September 11ths every year in order for there to be as many people killed by terrorist attacks as by guns or car crashes every year. Just the single events that you hear about can play up in your mind in ways that are somewhat irrational. The range of contacts, number 2. This basically gets to the diversity of people who you interact with. If you have a larger range of contacts, you have more diverse information about sexual norms. And if you have more diverse information about sexual norms, you can have more kind of people, a larger percentage of the people who you know who kind of sanction the behavior, think that it happens a lot, etc., etc. And third, the closeness of network ties. Peer approval is actually related to sexual behavior, but it's moderated by closeness, which makes sense. Basically, what that means is if you think that your peers approve of sexual behavior, but you aren't close to your peers, then that's not going to influence you, right? Groups don't exert pressure over people if the people don't care what the groups think. So all 3 of these things mean that if you have a lot of talk about sexuality, you have a more diverse group of contacts for whom some of them sexuality occurs more often, and if you care more about the groups that sexuality is talked about more often and is endorsed, then you are more likely to participate in these behaviors. Fairly straightforward. So speaking of Greeks, we actually don't know much about Greeks and sexual behavior. We have plenty of evidence about alcohol and substance abuse. Goodness gracious, I'm sorry. Plenty of evidence about alcohol and substance use, in that Greeks have higher levels. But we don't really know as much about sexuality, in part because a methodological concern, of course, I'm going to bring up, but this type of research is oftentimes done on college campuses by professors at those colleges. And there is a level of ickiness that can occur if a professor is asking students about their sexuality. When you ask people at your own college about their alcohol or substance use, there's not that same level of ickiness there for the researchers. And the ickiness for researchers also applies to the students participating in the studies. They might be less likely to participate in the studies, more likely to drop out, or more likely to lie about it if they think that their sexual behaviors are going to become known by faculty, even though, trust me, that does not happen. At least I've never experienced anything like that. We don't care what individual people do. We care about group level statistics. We care about averages across tons and tons of people. We never really look at an individual person. That's one of the ethical things that we stay away from, in part because honestly, it's not particularly interesting. But why do Greeks have more alcohol use? And alcohol use is key to hooking up, and the partying is also an aspect of the hooking up script. So why is it that this occurs? There are actually competing ideas. The first one is the socialization hypothesis. And the socialization hypothesis says basically that when a person gets into a group, they become more like that group. So I join a fraternity, I drink more because I'm around other people who drink more. The competing hypothesis with the socialization hypothesis is the selection hypothesis. And the selection hypothesis says that students who are more likely to join fraternities in the first place are more likely to join and participate in alcohol and substance use. They are more likely to be those people to begin with. It's not that the fraternity is changing them, or fraternity or sorority, excuse me, but it's that they're more likely to be drinking in the first place. The idea of joining a fraternity and being able to party is more appealing to them in the first place, and that's why they join it, the fraternity or sorority in the first place. And we know socialization is strong, especially in groups with such strong socialization as Greek as Greek organizations have. There's actually some interesting work that Greek and athletic groups actually have some similarities in terms of their socialization. And think about athletes who, oftentimes athletes are a relatively small, self-segregating group. They spend a lot of time together. There's a lot of buy-in to be a part of the group. Therefore, you can have the similar types of socialization. But there's some evidence that being in these groups can actually be associated with higher norms of peer support with sexual aggression. Now, while we don't know as much about sexuality in Greeks, we do know that there are a bunch of individual studies out there. Some have found higher rates of STDs in Greeks than non-Greeks. Greeks sometimes will report more sexual partners, more partners under the influence of drugs and alcohol, but less. But there are competing findings in other types of studies, in part because Greek organizations are have a fairly high degree of heterogeneity themselves. There are some religious fraternities. There are some where these things don't occur as much, so we can't paint with too broad a brush. Okay, well, let's move on from hooking up to romantic relationships. Let's assume that people are now in a romantic relationship. Before we get to some more about who we end up with, I want to first say that there is an impact on both physical and mental health that is associated with this. Social isolation, and this is one of those findings I've told you about before that just makes me kind of stop in my tracks and think about it every time I go over this. Social isolation can have as strong an effect on morbidity and mortality as smoking, blood pressure, obesity, and physical activity. Think about that. Social isolation can have as strong an effect on morbidity and mortality, basically how sick you get and how likely you are to die, as smoking, blood pressure, obesity, and physical activity. We know smoking is bad. We know high blood pressure is bad. Obesity is bad. Lack of physical activity bad. Well, as bad as those things are, social isolation can actually be just as bad. That's amazing what loneliness can do for you. And on the more positive side of this, morbidity and mortality is lower for people who are married than unmarried in relation to acute and chronic stress. Married people are less likely to have health threats like cancer, heart attacks, and surgery be particularly bad. And there are, again, the selection and protection hypotheses that pop up from time to time. The selection hypothesis says that people who are healthier are more likely to get and to stay married. Health problems can be a tremendous source of stress in couples. And so if you are healthier, you're more likely to stay in a relationship. On the flip side is the protection hypothesis, and that is that people are more likely to have material resources, social support, stress is lowered, and have fewer risky health behaviors when you are in a relationship. And that also makes sense, that if you have a spouse and you get sick and you have to stop working, well, your spouse might still have health insurance. You have someone there to keep you accountable for things. I do fewer risky things because I'm married and I have 2 kids. I honestly have thought before, I can't drive so fast right now, or I need to be careful. If I die, I'm leaving 3 people in a really bad situation. I also don't want to die, but okay, so who is it who we have romantic relationships with? So we found people. Now who is it that we are having? The single best predictor of whether or not 2 people get together is actually proximity, physical proximity. The people who we are close to being around, we are more likely to be in relationships with. You're more likely to be in a relationship with a random person from the state of Alabama than you are with a random person from the state of Washington. And while there is online communication, oftentimes we will filter out the people we talk to online based on proximity, and this is especially true in dating websites. You can say how far you're willing to go. The further away you are from people, the less likely the relationship is to succeed. And we also know that college students are more likely to date people they live by, whether it is the closer they are in a dorm to them, the closer they are in houses, apartments, etc., etc. The closer you are across the board, the more likely you are to be in a relationship with a person. But that's not as interesting as some of the other psychological things. So the second point here, mutual liking. Liking someone actually makes you more physically attractive to the other person. You are more physically attractive to other people, or to people you like. Why is this? Well, when you look at someone you find to be attractive, your pupils actually dilate a little bit, and people find that larger pupils are actually more attractive. So you are objectively more attractive to people you like than people you do not like. Also, if you like someone, you tend to be nicer to them, and people like nice people. 3, the mere exposure effect. Contrary to what people think, familiarity does not breed contempt. People prefer foreign words, geometric forms, human faces, all the more they see them. And we don't even have to be aware of this. This can be seen even if it's only for 5 milliseconds. If you see something for 5 milliseconds, to the point that you are not consciously aware of it, then you are more likely to say you like that thing that you saw for 5 milliseconds. So, do you think this would translate into real life? Well, I wouldn't be bringing it up if it didn't. So, one study took 4 women and got people to rate their attractiveness. They got a group of women, rated their attractiveness, and found 4 women who were rated equally attractive, or as very close to equally attractive. One girl had her picture taken. The other 3 attended class either 5, 10, or 15 times. So one attended 5, one attended 10, one attended 15. And then there were questionnaires completed by students in the classes after the course was done. And they viewed pictures of all of the women, and they said that the students who attended classes more often were more popular, honest, intelligent, and physically attractive. What does this mean? It means go to class. People will like you more if you go to class. But the point being, just being exposed to people can make them more attractive. And then finally in here, physical attractiveness. So I'm going to read you just a list of studies. You don't need to know these specifically. This is more meant to serve a point. So 5th grade teachers were given information and a picture to talk about, or a picture of a boy and a girl. The information was identical, though. And when they saw an attractive child, they said that they were smarter and more likely to do well in school. 5th grade teachers, if they had identical information, if they see an attractive kid, they said that they were smarter and more likely to do well in school. Another experiment. Male and female experimenters approached students on a college campus and tried to get the students to sign a petition. And the more attractive the experimenters were, the more signatures they got. Third study. Texas judges set lower bail and impose smaller fines on subjects rated as attractive on the basis of photographs. 4. Physically attractive men and women earn more money than those who are comparable in ability and everything else, except they are less attractive. 5. People were randomly assigned to talk to another person on the phone, opposite sex people. They were given similar information but different pictures. Men who thought they were talking to a beautiful woman spoke to her in more sociable ways. The men were more outgoing, interested, and rated their enjoyment of the conversation higher. Females who had partners who thought that they were attractive were also more charming and confident back. So, a woman, thinking that a woman was beautiful, helped men speak to them in ways that induced them to act more likable. Next, people went on dates, and they were randomly assigned to go on dates, and they found that the most important variable in determining whether people wanted to go on another date was physical attractiveness more than intelligence, personality, and attitudes. So, what's the point of all this? Attractiveness matters. But what is attractiveness? What is beauty? See on the screen here 4 relatively attractive people. Brad Pitt, he went to University of Missouri at least for a short amount of time, so we like him. Jon Hamm from Mad Men, good show. Amy Adams, who, if I wasn't married, would be the person I would try to marry. And Kate Mara, House of Cards, beautiful, beautiful woman. What makes people beautiful? Well, let's talk about it. But first, pause the recording and think to yourself, what are some things that make people beautiful to you? All right, so let's talk now about what beauty is. First of all, there's a question as to whether or not beauty is objective or subjective. So objective means that there are some criteria that people agree on, that there's something that across people would be the same. Whereas subjective means that individual people have their own opinions. So, is it objective or subjective? Well, how is it objective? First of all, there's high agreement about beauty. When people are asked to rate faces on a 10-point scale, there is high agreement between children and adults, males and females, and people from different cultures. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, what your race is, people are going to agree on who is more attractive. So you get a group of people, have people fill out from 1 to 10 how attractive they are. There's going to be a high correlation across kids and adults, males and females, different cultures, races, etc. This is true with attractive physical features. Men tend to like hourglass figures. Women like an inverted V from the waist to the hip. At least that's what the article says. And height also. Married men on average are 1 inch taller than non-married men of the same age. So there's agreement here. There's also features of the face that are associated with judgments of attractiveness. People tend to like faces where eyes, nose, lips are not too different from the average. And why is this? Well, we're actually more used to seeing prototypical face-like features, meaning the nose we are most likely to see in a given day is an average nose. That's a mathematical property, right? You have some people who have larger noses, some people have smaller noses, but you're more likely to see an average nose. So we are exposed to them more. This actually is true for dogs, fish, cars, watches. People like things that are not that different from average. But we also like symmetrical faces, and people think that this could be related to health, fertility, fitness. Basically, if you don't have a symmetrical face, maybe there is something going on. However, that is an area I'm actually not that aware of. But let's talk about this average face situation. So there is a website, sorry about this here, let's go ahead and ignore that, faceresearch.org, and the screenshots I have are from a couple years back. They have updated now to have a greater variety in types of faces and such. But nonetheless, here you can actually make average faces. You can select different pictures. You could select him and him and him and her, and you could make an average of all of them and see what that face would look like. So I did that, and by the way, you can go to this website up here and check it out. At least I think it's a pretty good time. So I did that for 3 different groups of people. So take a second and think, what did I do? I had some criteria in mind. I did something. I selected people based on something for each of these 3 faces. Well, what I did for this person over here, person on the left, I averaged all of the faces of people who I thought were attractive. I just picked the faces of the girls who I thought were attractive, and this was the average of that face. The middle is the average of everyone. This is actually, you take the average of every person on there, every female, sorry, and average them, that's what you get. At least that's what I got back a couple years ago. Not unattractive, right? I mean, fairly average looking. Makes sense, because it's the average. What about over here? Well, it sounds mean, but I took all of the faces of people who I didn't think were attractive and averaged them. And honestly, there's not that much difference between these two. And I don't think anybody would say that this theoretical person is unattractive. This is an attractive person right here. You take the averages even of the people who you might not think are attractive, like people who have really super huge noses, but then you take people who have super small noses, they average out to be average. That's the idea of averages. So across the board here, I mean, maybe, what does this say? A slightly darker skin tone, smaller face, I don't know. But anyway, go and try it out yourself. It's relatively interesting. Okay, and then the third one, research with infants on how it's objective. Babies are too young to have learned cultural standards in beauty, but they exhibit nonverbal preferences. As we've seen through studies with infants before, through habituation, babies actually tend to look at attractive faces longer than unattractive faces. And at least faces that are judged attractive by adults. And this is regardless of whether the person is young or old, male or female, black or white. Infants seem to have a really good sense of what adults view to be attractive, which is amazing. So those are all ways that it is objective, meaning there's criteria people agree on. But how is it subjective? Well, there are different ways of enhancing beauty. Makeup, hairstyling, etc., piercings vary from culture to culture, place to place, and not only culture, meaning across nations, but even within big countries. You could go to I don't know, what's the difference between a really preppy look versus a goth look. Just for example, you could have those same people in the same classroom. They would be trying to enhance their beauty in very different ways. Second, bodies differ. Heavy women are actually judged as more attractive than slender women in places where food is in short supply. Why is that? Well, some people think that that's because if there is not that much food and a woman can stay thicker, then maybe she would be able to have a child more easily, to more easily care for a child. If you are more able to turn food into energy, that could actually be a good thing for child rearing. Third, there are standards that change over time. So you could look at Playboy centerfolds And when I say you could, I mean there really was an article where they did this. They took the measurements of Playboy centerfolds and saw how it changed. Marilyn Monroe, who today people might think of a little bit thicker, versus the kind of stick figures who are the supermodels today, there's definitely been a change in what people think is beautiful in terms of the standards over time. And then finally, people are more attractive after you grow to like them, as an example of how things can change by circumstances. So you're more attractive after someone likes you. You actually, we'll talk about this when we talk about marriage, but you become more physically attracted to your partner as they get older, in fact. When you fall more in love with your partner, you are less attracted to the opposite sex. But also, the ratings of attractiveness of yourself can be different depending on who you are around and pictures you see. So for example, people feel less attractive after viewing supermodel-like members of the same sex. They feel more attractive if they view more homely-looking people, is how the article put it. So if beauty was purely objective, it wouldn't matter who you're around. You would know I am a 6, no matter where I am or who I'm around. But that's not how it works. So in general, is beauty objective or subjective? It's both. I also wanted to put a plug in. We're going to talk in future lectures about some of the negatives of beauty, but also wanted to mention that this is not just for humans. We actually tend to take a disproportionate care of animals that are attractive. Cute animals receive a disproportionate amount of aid and conservation effort. Some of the the ugliest birds that are close to extinction, like this guy up here, the greater adjutant, anyway, don't get a whole lot of help. Okay, and we already talked about beauty, but who else do we end up having relationships with? So we have the things we talked about before. Well, we also have relationships with people who are similar to ourselves. We are more likely to have relationships with people who are similar to us in age, education, race, religion, height, intelligence, socioeconomic status. We actually resemble people we hang out with and date and marry more than randomly paired couples. And this is true for colleges, it's true in college dorms, it's also particularly evident on the internet, where part of the way people will end up pairing off is attractive people will get online and say, I want a super attractive person, and the super attractive person that they said they wanted is more likely to say yes to another super attractive person because they want to be with a super attractive person, so they end up being together in that way. If you get a less attractive person who wants to be with a super attractive person, well, the super attractive person who looks at the less attractive person might not want to be with them. Rightly or wrongly, not judging here, but that's just kind of how it is. But when it comes to similarity, it's not just in physical ways, in terms of SES, other things like that. It's also in terms of issues. Couples can disagree on important moral issues, but actually, after they get together, they're more likely to bring their views into alignment. So if you have somebody who is pro-choice and you have someone who is pro-life, and both of them are really strict when they first meet, if they end up falling for each other, they're more likely to bring their views into alignment. Then they might not be 100% on the same side, but the person who is pro-choice might say, okay, some restrictions are okay, late-term abortion, for example. And the person who is pro-life might say, well, maybe sometimes it's okay, like rape and incest. They tend to shape each other more and more because you find out that people who disagree with you actually aren't just terrible, terrible people. And this gets also to another point, which is that some people think that similarity doesn't spark attraction, but rather that dissimilarity triggers repulsion. So you meet people here, and the first thing you do is you have what's called negative screening. You see if people are similar or dissimilar to you. If you are a right-minded person like me and you're a Yankees fan, and you see someone with a Red Sox hat on, you say they are dissimilar. I'm going to stay away from them. But if you see somebody with a Yankees hat on, you say, hey, that person's a reasonable human being, and you continue to interact with them. So the first screening could be just seeing if they are similar or dissimilar to you. Then, once you interact with them, you see how similar they are. This is for positive screening, is what we refer to this as. So if you are low in similarity, you might be indifferent towards them. High similarity, you would be attracted to them. And we don't just mean sexually attracted, physically attracted. This works with friends also. So let's take my Yankees example. This actually happened. I was at a party in grad school and saw somebody with a Yankees hat on, and I went over and I was like, oh, hey, how are you, da-da-da-da-da, and started talking about some games. This person turned out was not actually really a Yankees fan, just had a hat and went to the stadium before and whatever. And so I said, okay, you're okay, but I'm not going to hang out and talk about baseball with you for a while. You don't really care about baseball. Or more to the point, the Yankees. However, if someone were to be highly similar in this way, be a Yankees fan, then I could say, hey, this person, I like them. And you can continue to interact. Maybe say, hey, let's go get a beer and watch a game or something like that. You're less likely to do that with someone who is dissimilar to you. Let's get to a couple more things. We also have heard that opposites attract. We've already said that this doesn't occur, but sometimes opposites can attract when someone is when an opposite is complementary. Meaning that if someone is outgoing and starts dating someone who is reserved, that could actually be good. Someone who is by nature an introvert but wants to get out there and find friends and be liked and all this kind of stuff might want to be with someone who's more extroverted. Or a good listener might end up with someone who's more talkative. These can be ways where opposites can attract. Next up, matching hypothesis. And this is the idea that people become involved romantically with other people who are equivalent in their physical attractiveness. We talked about this a little bit when I talked about the online dating, but in general, people end up with people who are similar to them. So less attractive people end up with less attractive people, more attractive people with more attractive people, and we tend to say, whether or not you think we do and whether or not it's right or wrong, we tend to say if we see people who kind of violate this norm, like, what is going on? That she is way too good for him, or something along those lines. But again, not necessarily saying it's right. Then two more things, and then we're gonna wrap up a bit here. The first one is competence. People like people who are intelligent, strong, and socially skilled. But we actually don't like people who are too competent. In part because this can cause unfavorable comparison. So you end up with someone and they are really great people, they're really smart, they're kind, they're loving, all this kind of stuff. You might look at them and say, I am a horrible person, even if you're not. So one experiment, they took 4 tapes of people trying out for a quiz competition. 2 people they had get 90% of the questions right, and 2 people get 30% right. However, one of the 90% students spilled coffee on themselves during the taping. So who would be thought to be the most attractive person there? Well, of course, it is the counterintuitive response. The most attractive person was the person who got 90% but dumped coffee on themselves. The person who got 90% but didn't was not thought to be as attractive. In part because this person is good, but not too good. We want to match our ideal self. We don't want people who are perfect because they are closer to our ideal self than we are. We want to be good in all these ways, but we're not. Nobody is. So you want to be around people who are similar to you, make you feel good. And then finally, let's talk about evolutionary theory. Men like fertile women. And because of this, the appearance of youngness is good. Youth is correlated with fertility, and so things like a girlish figure, white teeth, high energy levels, those are all things that evolutionarily would indicate that people are able to have children. And in some places, as we said before, in places where food is in high demand, it can actually be thicker people who are more sought after because they could potentially have children in a way that people who do not have the nutrition adequate, at least appearance of nutrition, might not have. Women, on the other hand, evolutionarily, we would think would want mates who can provide resources like food, shelter, and protection, as we talked about with the gender lecture. But the best clue to this these days is socioeconomic status or social status, the ability to work hard. And one of the ways you can see this is think about the ways that people try to become more attractive to people of the opposite sex. Men tend to try to take women out to dinner, flash money, buy dinner, to show off their fancy car, all this kind of stuff that can show the relative ability to take care of people. Whereas women are more likely to care about things like makeup and clothing. The appearance is a little bit more, the youthful appearance is a little bit more attempted to be brought out. So things like getting rid of if you have wrinkles or if you have the skin blemishes, things like that, getting rid of those tend to be things women are more concerned about than men are, again, because of youthful appearances. All right, last up, let's talk about sex. One aspect of romantic relationships that is important is sexual behavior. The age of sexual intercourse has actually dropped in the last 50 years, meaning that about 20% of people have sex before 15, the average onset of sexual behavior is 17, and 3/4 of people have had sex by 20. We also know there are racial differences. Black people tend to have sex earlier than white people, but this actually, at least in the research I've seen, seems to be more correlated to socioeconomic status than it does to race, meaning that a poor white person is more likely to have the sex early than a wealthy black person, just as one example. And the concern about this primarily is not just sex for the sake of sex. I mean, in religious communities, yes, but the real concern that many people have is pregnancies, STIs. And part of the reason that this is so problematic is because frontal lobes haven't developed at this age. Early on, the frontal lobe, which is responsible for planning, is not, I mean, among other things, planning, is not developed until the 20s minimally. And so you can do things that are riskier, dumber across time. Now, the number of teenage pregnancies has dropped in the last decade by 1/3, and we actually now have had fewer, I think I just saw a couple days ago that we've had fewer teenage pregnancies than any time in recorded history in the recent years. And why has this occurred? Well, the book says that their awareness about the risks of unprotected sex have gone up. People are more aware of it. The rates of sex have gone down, just in general. Substitutes for sex have increased. Oral sex has actually increased as a percentage of sexual behavior relative to vaginal sex. Your book also says that abstinence movements have not worked, but at the same time say that abstinence pledges delay having sex by 17 months, which delaying having sex by a year and a half actually seems to be relatively successful, but I think it depends on how we're defining success. But even with improvements, we still have higher rates of teen pregnancy compared to other industrialized countries, and we're not sure why. But it's similar to so many other things. Why are we so much more violent? Why are we worse in academics? Why do we have all these problems that you wouldn't think that we should have, given where we are in terms of socioeconomic status and a variety of other factors? So hopefully this lecture has given you an idea of who we have romantic relationships with, why we have romantic relationships, and some of the factors, especially we spent a decent amount of time talking about attractiveness, what that does. But stay tuned, we will talk more and more about the negatives of all of these things as well in the future.